Company of Makers. Podcast talks, workshops.
This series is dedicated to those who served in Op Telic and their families, marking the 20th anniversary of the commencement of operations. Each episode, we'll talk to members of the armed forces community who served in Op Telic, or whose lives have been directly impacted. These are true life accounts, and these personal stories may be emotionally challenging to hear. If you feel you may be sensitive to this, you may prefer not to listen.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air. I'm Steve Bomford, co-founder of Company of Makers.
And I'm Tip Cullen, an actor and former Royal Marines Commando.
And today we're listening to Paula Harding's story, and I think this is probably the most difficult of all the stories that we'll be hearing as part of this series about the loss of her husband, Paul Harding, in Basra.
Yeah, without a shadow of doubt. I mean, it's an incredible story, and I'm so proud and so grateful that Paula was able to tell us this story.
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more. Paula, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast and tell what is going to be, I think, quite a difficult story.
Thank you for inviting me. And yes, it is a difficult story, but it is one that I like to share, as it shows the tenacity and the bravery of my two sons and how we've recovered from the loss of their wonderful father.
And I think, as you know, before we started recording, we talked about, the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War is coming up. And obviously this is what this podcast is about. But I think there are many stories there that need to be told. And I think if this in some way encourages people to share their stories, because not only are you going to talk to me, but you've written a book about this, which people will be able to purchase at some appropriate website, which we can put a link in the description about. So we're kind of going to follow that structure a little bit, isn't it? It seems like you've formulated how to tell the story. So let's follow that. So again, thank you very much. And off you go in terms of how did you start the book? I mean, that must have been a difficult place to start.
The book is actually written with a friend who actually was my casualty visiting officer. A casualty visiting officer is a person that is allocated to the next of kin when somebody is either killed in action or an act of terrorism, or it can be that it's been an accident. And so the army or the military allocates somebody who's going to be really the person that helps you and guides you through the next few weeks, months, to sort of recover from the loss. Mm. So we have written it together, and we started to write this during the first lockdown of COVID, where Gary was locked down in the Middle East, away from his family, and I was locked down in my house in Hampshire. And so with technology, we could easily write this through a G drive, and we just shared lots of different thoughts, and it just developed really. Originally, it was something that we were writing for our own children and future grandchildren. And then at the end, when we had finished writing it, we shared it with a few close friends and colleagues, and they all said this should be published. This should be shared in the wider arena, really, for all sorts of reasons.
So did you sort of, obviously families, being able to share that, because this is not the first time I've heard this with people. A lot of people have written books during the lockdown, and I think with that very aim in mind, but many have gone on to be published. Do you think the process of writing is part of the healing process, dare I say?
Yes. Yeah. And it had been, when we started to write this, it had been nearly 14 years. And I don't think I would have been prepared to write it any sooner.
Right.
it was healing. It was cathartic, but painful. And we both cried and reliving different memories and laughed. And it was also a way of clarifying in my mind what had happened. I did have to look back at letters, and I did have to sort of look back at diaries and dates and rethink it. And there were a couple of things I sort of had misremembered. And then talking, when it was read by the first sort of script was read by friends that were there with me in those very early days, I think it helped them too. And they said, "Oh no, I don't think it quite happened like that." And we would discuss it. And I think it was a cathartic exercise for everyone, really, that was involved.
And that's the power of sharing the story, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Did Gary? I assume Gary knew your husband. Did he?
Yes. So Gary and Paul had served with the Royal Green Jackets, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Green Jackets. And, Paul had been, when Paul was killed, he'd been in the army 31 years. We'd been together 22 years, 20 years married. And I actually had met Gary the weekend I met Paul in August 1985. So Gary was a subordinate to Paul, which means basically he was sort of following a similar career path, but he was a different peer group. He was a few years behind Paul in age and seniority. I think he was a rifleman or a corporal when Paul was a sergeant. So it's that sort of structure, and they sort of followed through that structure as they progressed through their careers.
So is that deliberate? Does the army in this instance deliberately choose someone that's known to the family to support you through this role? Okay.
No, not at all. Usually it's somebody, quite often it's somebody that has no knowledge of the family. When Paul was killed, we were near Worthy Down, which is near Winchester, and the norm would be that they would have gone to somewhere like that and found a duty officer that could step in as a casualty visiting officer. However, it's explained in the book how when this happened, the battalion were trying to decide on how to move forward. It was going to be, they knew it was going to be a massive loss to not just the regiment, but the British military, the army, because of course seniority, a late entry officer who served 31 years is a huge loss, because it's just, one, it's completely unexpected, and two, they're losing sort of a father figure of the regiment. And so it was decided that Gary would be an obvious choice, and he accepted that role without hesitation.
Yeah, all power to him. So how do you start the book? I mean, does it actually start with the moment that your husband was killed? Is that the way you did it?
No. The opening is really a tribute to people who are real heroes, that are willing to give their life for their friends. And there's a commemoration to the recipients of the Elizabeth Cross, which is the medal that Queen Elizabeth decided she wanted to award the next of kin of those people that have either been killed in action or by an act of terrorism from the end of the Second World War. So it was retrospectively given to people, the next of kin from those who've given their lives. And we commemorated it to all of the people who've received the Elizabeth Cross. So all the families who've lost somebody in service for this country, Queen and country. And then we explain, that this is freedom isn't free. Freedom comes with a mortgage, and the mortgage is the loss. and the pain and the grief. Not only does Paul miss out, from the age of nearly 48, he's missed out on seeing his sons marry and seeing grandchildren born and having the life that he deserved after serving his country, but the loss that we live with every day, and all the families that have lost parents, loved ones, children. And so we talk about how we have inherited this freedom from people who've given their all. And then the first chapter is actually way back in the 80s, and it starts with Gary, and he's a young 16-year-old in Liverpool, and he's fallen on the wrong side of the law. And he's been living in quite a deprived area of Liverpool, and he describes how he falls into the army. Really, it's a choice, basically. A very knowledgeable old beat police officer comes and speaks to him and says, really, you've got two choices. You're going to go to prison or get yourself in the army. And he ends up on a train down to Winchester, ends up in Peninsula Barracks, and he becomes a soldier. And then he goes on to describe some time in the army and then going to Germany. And the battalion is posted to Germany, and he gets to know Paul, who's an up-and-coming sergeant that everybody aspires to be like. And then it moves on to the second chapter, which is it's 1985, the summer of Live Aid, and I go out to Germany to have a little holiday with my sister, who's also married to a green jacket. And I meet Paul at a rifle ball, the summer ball. And then, I go on to tell how that summer developed. And we end up getting engaged after 3 weeks.
Wow. You sent me, you sent me a link to a little radio interview you did, and you talk about it being a love story. And obviously that's quite clear from it's a whirlwind romance as well, isn't it? It's lovely to hear that.
Yes, it was. I never believed it before, but I do believe in love at first sight. And I had actually been going out with somebody for 2 years, and I had to give them the call from Germany, and I felt dreadful and guilt, but I knew immediately that what I thought the relationship I was in was, love. Within days, I just knew that it was different with Paul. And I described that summer in Germany, and then he goes off to Northern Ireland for 6 months to Belfast with the Battalion, and I return to England and I start my nurses training, and then I take us through that sort of first year or two until we get married, and then of course the next chapter is back to Gary. And he then moves on to a different chapter of a tale that he's telling.
Okay, and how did Paul's career progress, and how did that affect you? Because being a service wife's not always that easy, is it?
No, it's not. And there wasn't anything like paternity leave or anything like that in those days. So my next couple of chapters are about the moves we make. We get posted to Winchester, and then we get separated because we bought a property thinking that was the best thing to do. Our little boy is very poorly, and then we get posted to Deal. We get posted to Dover, and whilst we're in Dover, it was the height of the Troubles when the IRA had cells dotted around the country, and they were very, very active. They were murdering not only serving personnel, but wives and children of serving personnel. And we were living in our house in Deal when the atrocity of the bombing of the Deal barracks, the Royal Marines Band, happened. Yep. And so I sort of stepped out of the story, so to speak, several times because I wanted my children and grandchildren to recognise as a country what we were going through. You know, we were living with terrorism for decades, not just in Northern Ireland, but on the mainland as well. And how difficult those times were. We had to live very secretively because we bought our own house. There were simple things like I couldn't put Paul's combats on the line because I didn't know who was living next door. I didn't really divulge to people what Paul did. If I went to see my friends at the army quarters in Dover, I would do different routes each time. So because at the time the IRA were watching, and if you did the same route several times, they knew, to expect you. And that was their
Did you do
ploy.
that of your own volition, or was there any guidance to tell you what to do?
It was Paul.
Okay.
It was Paul. And I thought he was being a little bit, sort of overprotective, but he was the professional. And so I did what he asked. And then there was a wife, Heidi, that was killed in Northern Ireland. She was shot by 2 IRA terrorists dressed in English combats. She came out of her quarter in Germany. She got into a car and they just walked straight up and shot her point blank while she was sitting at the wheel of her car. And that, I explain in the book, just sort of really brought it home why Paul was being so adamant that we had to be careful. And then the first Iraq conflict begins. We've got a 10-month-old and we've got a 2-year-old, and it's the start of January 1991. And we're posted to Omar in Northern Ireland. So I end up going on a Hercules with 2 babies to Northern Ireland. And that's quite funny, I look back and I think, what were we doing, but that's the way it was in the early 90s. You went with your husband. We lived in Northern Ireland for 2.5 years, and quite a lot happened in this chapter. An awful lot happened. I sadly lose one of my closest friends' husbands, and men that I got to know that were working in the camp that were then killed by the IRA. The house was shot at because they missed the tower that was the duty serviceman, and the IRA missed that and hit our house. It was quite, it sounds dreadful, but there are quite humorous points to it. But also, again, I wanted, firstly, my sons and grandchildren, and then the wider community to see what we did actually live through in the 90s as military families.
Well, it's important to share these stories, and also it gives context to the experiences that people had before they were deployed on Op Telic.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what everything is leading to, really. Paul's climbing through the ranks. He had got his warrant officer class 1, been made the RSM. We were in Oxford and then posted to Cyprus. We'd had a problem with the battalion had a problem with discipline in Cyprus. I think the men had gone a little bit wild. They were sort of sunsy, and things had got out of hand. And Paul was posted as the regimental sergeant major to Cyprus, where we were for a very short period, under a year, and then he comes back and he gets his commission. And then, so the next part of the story is Paul's rise through the commissioned officers' ranks. So by now he's started life as a rifleman. He's gone through all of those ranks, and then he's commissioned. And I talk about the work that he's doing as an officer, and then we come to the sort of autumn of 2006, and the battalion is readying themselves for deployment the next spring to Basra. Paul by then is the company commander of support company, and which is an unusual thing. Most LE officers, if they do get a company command, it's usually HQ, which is all the logistics support. But Paul was actually given command of a of a rifle company,
Yeah.
which he was absolutely over the moon about. However, he was then, because it's support, the company was sort of broken up to go off and support other parts of the battalion. And he was then sort of left really without a job. And it wasn't looking like he was going to go to Basra, which of course I was chuffed about, really pleased. He was very disappointed. He wanted to be out there with his men. And then so they're doing all the training. They've done, live firing in Canada and different things. And then it comes to a few months or so before they're meant to deploy. And Paul comes home and he says, I've been asked by Colonel Patrick if I would go out and be part of the Provisional Joint Control Centre, which is an outpost in Basra. It's a small outpost, and they needed somebody with Paul's experience to sort of run the logistics and support the mix of regiments that were there doing this particular job. And I could quite clearly see that he would really want to do this. But he said, if you really don't want me to go, I won't. But I couldn't have stopped him. And so, yeah, he deployed.
So how did you feel at that moment? Because you already said you weren't that keen. How did that feel?
He'd done so many postings away from us. He'd done several, 4, 5, 6-month tours of Northern Ireland, in different parts of Northern Ireland. He'd done Sierra Leone, he'd done Kosovo, Bosnia, he'd been to the Falklands. So I was, preparing myself for 6 months without him. But we had to go for a briefing that the Colonel gave, Colonel Patrick Sanders. And it was like no other pre-deployment briefing I'd been to. The language was very, very serious. I remember Patrick saying, when we have casualties.
Yeah.
And the sort of emotion that sort of flooded through this room that all the families were seated in, all the wives and the men, all ranks. And I spoke to Paul afterwards and I said, Patrick said when, not if. And he said, this is going to be the toughest of the tours of Op Telic. This was the final one. This was going to be handing, Iraq, the Iraqi army. There was going to be a lot of opposition about it. And it was, and I think that's why he wanted to be there even more, to really be there for his men and for that phase of Op Telic, really. So we came away from that meeting, we drove home and had a last couple of days with him at home. And then I took him early at the weekend. I took him early in the morning and had to take him to the camp at Bulford. And from there, he was with his men and they deployed out to Basra.
What were you feeling at that moment when you said goodbye?
It's horrific, absolutely horrific. I drove us there. We went through the gates. We swung round. He wanted me to park up on the far side of the square. I don't think he wanted the men to see me, because I, did look upset, and he was always thinking of the men. And, he hugged me and he said, it'll be the last one. He didn't have that much longer. He was probably looking to come. Well, we knew he was looking to come back, pick up his colonel, a couple more years, and he was going to retire. So, this was going to be the last one. And he said, he just said his goodbyes, hugged me. I just watched him walk across the square, go through the doors, and that was it. And then later on that day, I checked my emails and I saw he'd actually managed to send me an email from his office before they'd left for the for the RAF flight, and he'd emailed me a little letter saying if anything happened, basically not to let it affect my life and time with the boys.
Wow.
And they were just 17 and just 19, so it was a crucial time for their lives.
That's right. Do you want to take a moment there? Sorry. You okay?
Yeah. Right. I'm just going to text my staff.
That's okay. You take your time, Paula. Absolutely take your time.
I'm just going to tell them to get the dogs quiet.
If you want to get yourself a glass of water or something, feel free.
2 seconds.
It's okay.
Okay.
Well, we know that, I mean, this is obviously a difficult story, but this is why you're telling it, of course, because I think people need to understand that this is difficult and, decisions are made about deployments and there are consequences for not just for the individuals, but families as well. And I think we'd both agree it's important, well, that you talk about it and hopefully we can share it as well.
Yes, absolutely. It is an emotional story. But as you've just said, it has to be told. I felt it had to be told, firstly, for the family and now the wider field. And as I said at the beginning, everybody's freedom comes with a cost. Yeah. And I think we can forget that here in the countries like us, Britain and other very fortunate countries where we can say what we feel. We have to remember there's many countries that people do not have any freedom of speech, not have the freedoms that we take for granted.
And we do take them for granted, but I think that's probably that's a whole podcast in its own right, isn't it, to talk about how we take things for granted.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So Paul was in Basra, I assume, and did you have any communications with him?
The communications were very sporadic. They couldn't use mobile phones. We're talking 15 years ago. So mobile phones they weren't the mobile phones we have now. They were the very, very basic ones. And they couldn't be sure about the security of the mobile phones. So there were secure telephones that could be used. And the problem with those, they were very public. And Paul was a very private man, and he wouldn't be able to sit on a public telephone and speak openly about how he felt, and I knew that, so I knew it was going to be 6 months of sort of maybe one call a week that would last a couple of minutes, but it was still lovely just to hear his voice. But we communicated with blueies, which are the aerogram blue letters that were British Forces aerograms, and they were free. You could, when somebody was in theatre, you could write to them as often as you liked, and they could write back, and they'd be put on an RAF flight and brought home or sent out. So I tended to write one of those a day or two of those a day.
Wow.
And then pop them in a post box, and I would get maybe 3-4 a week. And in those, you could be really open. He could tell me things because they were secure, and I could, sort of basically give him a rundown of our daily life. And we'd done that ever since we were married. So I have a chest of hundreds of these blueies, which is lovely to look back on. And they form a sort of diary of 22 years. So that was our main form of communication. And then if I didn't get the call, which happened in the May, I would worry, even though it was sort of sporadic. By the end of the week, if I hadn't had a call, I'd be really worried. And that did happen when the PJC was almost overrun by militiamen in May. And I explain in the book how this attack had happened, and it was over 200 militiamen that had tried to take over the outpost, and it was a really difficult time. I hadn't realised it had happened. I didn't really look at the news. I didn't really get involved with the news, and the news wasn't really explained thoroughly or properly. So I just didn't take any notice of the news or the newspapers. I just got on with my own life. And then after a few days of being away, not receiving this call, I had a call from Paul, and he sounded absolutely exhausted, dreadful. I hadn't realised that they'd been under siege for 3 days. They'd run out of rifle oil. They'd had to use cooking oil to oil the rifles. One of the men was seriously injured, and they had to organise a extraction for him onto a helicopter on the roof of the building they were in. They were under siege. Paul was mentioned in dispatches partly for that action that time. And he phoned me, and he sounded dreadful. And I was just relieved to hear from him. And I said, "Oh, what's been happening?" And he said, "Oh, we've had some visitors." I didn't know he meant insurgents. In my head, I thought, "Oh, I wonder who's visited them," and I couldn't imagine. I don't know, sort of any sort of dignitaries going out there to visit them. And we moved on to a different conversation. It wasn't till after he was killed that I found out what had happened, and I found out what he'd meant. But he was never going to tell me. He wasn't going to worry me. He knew my tactic was to keep away from the news and everything. So he just made light of it. That was typical of Paul, really.
So he made that call whilst this was all happening then, is that, if I got that right?
It had just finished. They'd just beaten the attack back. It had taken a couple of days, but they had actually managed to secure the building and prevent the overrun of the control centre.
Okay. Do you know the circumstances of his death? Do you?
Yes, I do. So that was the end of May. 3 weeks later, they attacked again.
Right.
And they attacked when a convoy was coming in. So if you imagine a very small compound that's highly secure with a gate, that's the same gate to enter and exit. And then you've got a building inside that gate where you've got a mixture of British and Iraqi army, and they're in the process of handing over to the Iraqi army. And then the militia around you in Basra know what's going on, and they want to stop that happening. And then 3 weeks after that attack, a convoy was coming through bringing supplies. It was the only way they were going to get food and water, ammunition, etc. And as the convoy was coming in, they came under attack. There was snipers shooting at the people by the gate, and the drivers trying to come in. And there was a problem with getting the vehicles in. So Paul, once they realised they were under attack, Paul left the building where he was safe. And I heard from several other servicemen who passed Paul on the stairs, and he was telling them to go back and get their helmets on and their body armour. And he was putting on his helmet and body armour, and they ran out the building. And he didn't hesitate. He went straight down to the front where the convoy was trying to come in. And he entered what's called a sangar, which is a concrete building, small little building, which has got a small, about the size of a brick for you to look out, a little window, without glass, of course. And it's protected by sort of concrete blocks and a very safe roof. He's looking out through this aperture to see what's going on, to try and spot where the snipers are he's giving orders of how to get the vehicles in and how to defend themselves. And then they start to fire rocket-propelled grenades, and one clips the aperture that Paul is looking through, and as the grenade hit that, the blast came through the opening where Paul was looking out, so he could give the orders.
Gosh.
And he was killed instantly.
When did you find out what had happened?
So the night that he was killed, it was the 19th of June. We live in a village in Hampshire. It's a beautiful village. It was very hot, beautiful evening. And I'd come home from work and my youngest son was home. He was doing some college work, and then he was going out to meet some friends. And I did my normal routine, walk the dogs, had tea, and then I was waiting to see if Paul would call, because it's quite often a Wednesday he managed to get a call. And I was just about sort of to give up and go to bed when the phone rang. And it was about 10, 11 o'clock. And we were on the phone and we were chatting, and he was chatting, quite happy, quite upbeat. I was telling him the news of what the boys were up to. Christopher, our eldest son, was at university, and he'd just started dating the girl that was going to be his wife, future wife. Of course, we didn't know that. And I just said to him, "Oh, Chris has got a girlfriend," and he said, "Oh, good for him." And then the line went dead, and I thought, "Oh, we've lost contact." So I sort of sat there waiting for the phone to ring back, and then I went and got a glass of wine and sat with this large glass of wine, trying to sort of stay calm and tell myself everything was okay. And at midnight, I thought, right, he's not going to phone back. And I went to bed, and thankfully, I just sort of fell straight to sleep. And then I woke up and looked at the clock, and it was 2 a.m. and the dogs were barking. And our bedroom was above the front of the house, and they were in the kitchen. I could hear them barking, and that's when I just had this awful, awful fear just gripped me.
Mm.
And I stood up and I looked out. I went into another bedroom at the front of the house, but I had a better view of the street. And I could see the security light had come on, and I could see the black car. And I just knew. I knew why they were there. Then I came running down the stairs, and unusually, I was actually told by a very old friend of Paul's, and he was the commander of the rear guard, which were the people that had stayed behind from Basra and hadn't gone to Basra. And he was at the door with the family's officer, and I just knew, and I was begging them to tell me it was just he was injured, but they just kept saying sorry. And I just knew then that, they wouldn't have come knocking at the door if they weren't absolutely sure. And then the nightmare began.
So part of that, I guess, is telling your boys.
Yeah, my youngest had woken up. He came running down the stairs. He just saw the scene, and I'm so sorry. And we just fell into each other's arms, and he was saying the same. Are we sure? Are we sure? And yeah. And that's just the worst, is to see your child who is just devastated and has been, so close. They were so close.
Mm-hmm.
3 of them were like the 3 musketeers. And that was the hardest thing, is I just kept saying, "I'm sorry." And he kept saying, "I'm sorry." And there was just nothing else we could say to each other.
No.
And then the whole army protocol kicks in, and you then start to learn this process that, of course, you never imagined you'd go through or would want anyone to go through. And that's that they need to have photos straight away, because if they give the photo to press. The press will basically step back for 24 hours. They've got a photo. They won't go looking for photos or take photos that you'd rather them not have. And then the whole thing that you've discussed before, years before, who are you going to put down as your next of kin? You know, when we got married, oh, well, I'll put down me, and I'll put down your mum, and I'll put down my parents, as Paula decided. And then you find out that it is a legally binding document, and those people have to be told before anybody else. So even though Christopher was turned 19, he wasn't meant to really be told until I'd been told, Paul's parents had been told, and my mother had been told. And my mother then was in her 80s. His parents were in their late 70s. And so I asked, you know, how this was going to be done. And they said, well, we've got a casualty visiting officer has been chosen for, well, not the casualty visiting officer, but the person had been chosen to go and tell Paul's parents the awful news. And where was my mother? And I explained that my mother was down in Devon with my niece on holiday. And I said, but whatever happens, I've got to tell Christopher before he finds out any other way. And he was in Exeter. And madly in my head, I'm thinking, if I need to get in the car and drive to, you know, Exeter, I will drive there, but he's got to be told. And then they just put that all into place, and an army car took us to the camp at Walford, switched into another army car, and we found ourselves hurtling down the A303. You know, just as sort of the sunrise was coming up behind us, and we landed at Exeter. And I remembered that it had been Christopher's summer ball, and by now I think it's about 5 a.m. and I just texted him, you know, and he texted back and he said, where are you? And I said, we're outside your halls of residence. And then I just saw him hurtling across the, you know, these manicured lawns of the university, hurtling through the flower beds, and in his DJ with his bow tie undone, and he just looked horrendous. And I just thought, he knows.
Mm.
And that as soon as I, you know, sort of told him, I sort of felt inside this relief that, okay, I've got my boys together now.
Yeah. I can't imagine how painful that was.
No, I couldn't describe it, to be honest.
Mm.
It's undescribable. I just kept thinking, this is when people talk about a broken heart, this is what it really is, because it is real pain. It's physical pain. You really feel like your chest has just gone into a heart attack. It's just physical pain that is unimaginably painful.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So what happened next in terms of does the army support you through this process, or what, you know, did you rely on your family? How, because you've talked about Gary, obviously. I guess Gary gets involved at some point.
He gets involved that day. We're brought back to her house, and we're, you know, sort of sitting there, and I'm saying, have you got hold of Paul's parents? By now, they had told my niece, and my niece had told my mother. So it was just, we couldn't tell anybody else until Paul's parents were told, because that was the protocol. And then they explained to me that they were at Paul's parents' house, but there was no answer. And as the hours of the night had gone on and then it had turned to daylight, it was clear that there was nobody at home. And I didn't know where they would be. So I tried to get hold of Paul's sister, and I couldn't get hold of Paul's sister. I hadn't realised she was on holiday. And then it became, when I finally managed to sadly speak to Paul's sister and explain what had happened, she explained to me that his parents were on holiday. They were in Sri Lanka. And so we had no idea where they were. And I was just saying to the chaps that had told me the news, I really, really need to get some friends here for my children. I need to get Paul's friends here for my children. Then they were saying, right, we're going to try and find Paul's parents. And then they explained the process of a casualty visiting officer. And they said that, they normally would just allocate somebody and they could get somebody instantly from Worthy Down, or they had somebody in mind that was from the battalion. And I said, who would it be? And they named Gary. And they said, would you want that? And I just instantly said yes. I was just so thankful it was going to be somebody that would know us. We weren't, our families, his wife is a very independent lady and I'm a very independent woman. So we meet sort of socially at the battalion, but we were both getting on with our own lives. But I knew that Paul knew him and he knew Paul. And I knew that there would be this connection rather than a total stranger that I'd have to explain everything to. And the ways and wherefores of the regiment that have now become the Rifles. And it's quite a unusual, regiment. So it just made a lot of sense to have somebody that understood us.
Yeah.
And so that whilst that was going on, that they said he was going to have to travel down from the north and he would be here later, I was saying, well, when am I going to get, some friends to come? And they came in and they said that they'd managed to get hold of the Foreign Office and somebody, they'd found out which hotel his parents were staying in, and they had managed to contact them. And then that's, I could then start to contact friends that I knew would be the best support for the boys and myself, really.
So, as if none of that's difficult enough, I believe the press would have obviously got involved in this. Was that a factor for you?
Yeah, they gave us 24 hours.
Yeah.
Which enabled us to tell the majority of people. My fear was that they would hear it. My greatest fear was people that knew us, that loved us, that would just hear it on the news or hear it, on the radio. And I think we succeeded in getting everybody told, really. And then it just exploded. We sat down when the 24 hours were up. We sat down, and that was one of the most surreal moments of my life, was to sit with my friends. We were on the floor, on the sofas, on the chairs, just looking at the news, the 9 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news, and just seeing Paul, one of all these faces that we'd seen, and now it was him. And they were telling us how, this longest serving senior member of the army had been killed defending his men in Basra. And I just thought, this can't be real. And I just went upstairs and just took his spare berry out and just lay on the bed hugging it and just praying this was all a bad dream. But it wasn't.
No. Did you have to interact with the press? Did any of that, cause any problems, or were there any other consequences in the immediate aftermath?
Gary gave me the best advice. Do not get involved in any way whatsoever unless it's through the army. And I stuck to that.
Okay.
I later found out from other poor families that they'd managed to be cajoled and enticed to talk to press, and then how things got twisted and changed or not told correctly. And I just didn't. And I had wonderful neighbours, and the villagers of, my friends and neighbours in the village, none of them spoke to the press. They just turned their backs and didn't get involved. And when people came to the door and knocked, one of the friends would just go to the door and say, we're not making a comment. And they just let us be up until Paul's birthday. So he was killed in the June, and his birthday was August. And one of his closest friends had come over with his children, his teenage children, and we'd jointly gone out for a walk with our dogs on his birthday. And we'd come back and we were in the garden, just sort of chatting about Paul and that. And the doorbell went. I went to the door, and it was a journalist, and I just said, "Oh, hang on," I didn't know what to say, and I just shut the door. And Paul's friend went to the door, and I don't think that journalist knows how lucky he was that he actually just said, "We've got nothing to say. Please leave the house." He said, "Oh, we understand it's his birthday today." And this chap had been one of Paul's groomsmen back in the 80s and had really suffered at the loss of Paul. And I think that journalist was a very lucky man. He just shut the door. You know, it was not a day we particularly wanted to talk about Paul. And that was it.
It doesn't feel appropriate either, to be quite honest.
No, it doesn't on his birthday. For some reason. And then I think that just works. I think just not making a comment, they just end up giving up and looking for the next story. And sadly, you know, there were more lives lost after Paul, and they moved on. Yeah.
So, I guess, how does the healing process start? I'm assuming that started at the funeral. Is that fair to say? You said to me it was it held at Winchester Cathedral?
Yes, it was. It sort of, I never imagined that at all. You know, with the battalion still being in Basra, you know, the majority of his sort of serving colleagues and men were all and were all over there still. So I didn't imagine it was going to be a huge affair. You know, I was thinking of the chapel in the local barracks, which was the new barracks by then. It wasn't in the old Victorian ones in the town. It was on the outskirts. It was now an army training regiment. I was thinking, oh, we could have have the chapel service and then go into a mess for a buffet or something. And then it slowly, I think Gary just dripped information as he could judge I could take in over the next few weeks. He took me through this process of Paul's repatriation, that you know, in the Hercules brought back from Basra. Sadly, Paul's body was also accompanied by a chap whose twin had been killed a couple of days after Paul. His twin had died on their 24th birthday. So in this Hercules coming back, it was Paul's remains and this young man's remains of the 24-year-old and this 24-year-old twin. They came back all together and were taken through Wootton Bassett. So Gary sort of took me through all of that process, all the different sort of processes that needed to be done. And then, you know, we were planning the funeral, and it became more and more apparent that there were going to be far too many people to fit into a small chapel and a mess. And as we were just chatting one day with our friends and that, somebody suggested the cathedral, and I just sort of, you know, very funny. And then the next thing I knew, it was, would you have it, you know, Paul, did you want a military funeral? I said, oh, absolutely. You know, he joined up at 18 and he's died a soldier. Of course, that's exactly what I want for him. And then another military process came into being, that this is the way it's done and you can't defer off that route. It's a military funeral. And I think that really helped me, because it sort of took a lot of choices away from me. It's like, this is how we do it. This is how it's going to be done. And then as soon as I said, oh, yes, okay, if that's where you think it should be, it was, you know, it was another thing that Gary just sort of guided us through. And then the day of the funeral, it was just incredible. You know, we had a police escort through the city. The roads were closed. We were pulled up outside the cathedral. You couldn't see the grass outside the cathedral in the close. It was absolutely full of townspeople. I'd worked at the sixth form college there, and it was all the staff and students. About 2,000 were there. And then, you know, we followed Paul's hearse, and then he was, you know, removed from the hearse. And the cathedral doors were opened, and the cathedral itself was full. absolutely full. And it's so incredible to see so much support for us, but so many people that were grieving. The wave of grief just hit me, but it was a comfort in a way. He wasn't, forgotten.
So it helped.
Yeah, it did help. It was, I didn't realise at the time, but I think it was, and I don't think it started the healing process, but I think looking back, it meant a lot to my sons and me that, we had all these people there, not just supporting us and remembering Paul, but supporting each other. And the service itself was beautiful. And it, as I said, it was completely following the military way, the traditions that go back hundreds of years of, Paul's the Union flag being taken off his coffin and folded and given to me, his sword being given to my eldest son, his medals were given to my youngest son, and then we had to turn, and when we left the cathedral and we walked down the nave after Paul's coffin, I had to have my eldest son on my right hand side holding the sword. It was quite surreal. And then looking back, it's an honour really that, kings and queens have been buried at Winchester Cathedral, had services there, and it was, I think we did him proud.
Certainly sounds like it. So you touched on the road to dealing with it, recovery, and understanding what had happened and processing and all of that, which I'm sure was not a short process. But I'm going to say, how did you go about that? I don't know if you had I'd be surprised if you had a plan, if you know what I mean. So how do you go about it?
I think somebody said to me who'd lost, and one of the strangest things was other widows came out of the woodwork, people I'd worked with that I hadn't known had been widowed young. I was getting notes from people who'd lost their husbands and partners, and all of them said, keep breathing, and take every second as it comes. Just keep going. And it's literally that. I think it started for me the following day of the funeral was the first time my house was empty. I woke up in the morning, and for a few weeks now, it had been like a railway station of people coming through and decisions having to be made. Days that I had to get up and get my hair done, get dressed and go and do something, go to the airport, go to, these different processes. So the following morning after Paul's funeral, I woke up. The boys were still upstairs asleep. It was, July, it was still very warm. I came down, and one of the things we'd had on the altar at the cathedral was a huge photograph we'd had blown up of Paul. And it was one of the last I'd taken of him the night before he deployed, and it was in our back garden. And he was in his desert combat. And it was a lovely photograph, and it was fully blown up. And I was sitting at the far end of our lounge, as further away from the French windows as you could get. But the doors were open, and I sat down on this sofa, and at the far end of the lounge was this photo, and I sat there looking at Paul, and I had my German Shepherd Cross sitting beside me, who would chase everything out the garden. Nothing could move without her going out and telling them all off. She was sitting there looking at me with her chin on my knee, and I looked down the lounge, looked at Paul's photo, and I said out loud, "Oh God, Paul, what am I going to do now?" And in flew a robin, and this robin landed at my feet, and I looked at this bird, and I looked at my dog, who normally would have chased it out the house, let alone out the garden, let alone out the house. She looked at it, and she just left her chin on my knee, and this bird sat there for a good 30 seconds, and then this bird flew out, and I just thought, okay, whether that's a sign whether that's Paul giving me a message, it just struck me that I've got to do this. If a bird can fly in and sit with my German Shepherd and the dog doesn't bark at it, then anything can happen. I can get through this.
But it's a really,
I think that's the point. It started.
Yeah, it's a really poetic moment, though, isn't it?
It was absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people might think, oh, she's imagined it. But I was sitting there on my own in my lounge looking at this bird thinking, what has just happened? And that was the moment. I mean, I've had my bad moments, good moments. But the process then began, and it went on for a very long time. And Gary was there for every step of the way.
Mm.
And I can quite honestly say I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't had that support. And I don't know how people don't have that support get through a trauma like this. I take my hat off to them. And I know different situations are different. We had some really difficult times. We became subject to hate mail, which was something nobody was expecting. And Gary was there for that as well. So,
sorry, what do you mean by hate mail? I don't know if you know who, but from whom? What was if you don't mind me asking, what was the reason for that?
So what happened was after Paul's death became public knowledge, it was incredible the amount of letters we received, and it went on for weeks and weeks. It started off like 4 or 5 letters a day. It went up to 20 letters a day, and then it gradually went back down to 3 letters. And it wasn't just people linked to the military. It was from people from all over the country. And our postman at the time we'd had for a long time, and he knew us very well. And some of these letters just literally said, my name and the village and the county, and somehow it found its way to me because it was a very small community at the time. And then one morning, my eldest had got up and he'd gone out for a run, and he'd just sweeped up the stack of posts that was on the doormat and put it on the breakfast bar. And I'd come down and I was just sort of flicking through it just to see, I wouldn't open them all at once, maybe once or twice, because I'd cry at every letter. And I picked up this buff-coloured envelope, and it had the address, apart from the number of the house. And that wasn't unusual because, as I said, we were receiving posts that had very sketchy addresses on. And another very, very incredible experience at that point, I stood there holding the letter, and I felt an enormous pressure down my side. It was almost like somebody was really leaning into me. And I had this feeling in my head. It was like somebody saying, don't open it. And being quite stubborn, I was thinking, oh, you're being ridiculous. And I just opened up the envelope, slid it out. And it was very peculiar English. There were vowels missing and that, but you could easily, your brain sort of puts in the bits that are missing, and I could read it, and it just started to describe how Paul was being called a hero, but he wasn't. He was XYZ, and it was a bit malicious. It was very nasty, and I just slipped it back in, and I called Gary. Now, Gary, you'll find out from the book, is fluent in Arabic. And his side of the story of the Op Telic is very interesting because he writes it from a serving personnel. And he was involved for years, probably, if you put all the time he was out there together during that operation, using his language skills. So he arrived, he came down on his motorbike, he arrived rather quickly, came in, took the envelope off me, had a look at it, put it away, and I could see the red mist come over him. And then he said, okay, don't worry about it. What did you read? And I said, just the first line. And he said, right, okay, any more envelopes come, don't touch them. Anyway, he went off and the process went on, and he quite quickly had realised that it was sort of similar to how maybe not a very educated person who spoke Arabic would then translate it to English, because of the vowels were missing and there were these different hints of that. Anyway, it became a part of a big investigation. We had more, and we actually we smile about it now, because we had to go and have our fingerprints taken at the police station in Winchester, because of course it was all forensically looked at and they had to rule us out. It was, more letters came and we wouldn't touch them, and I think they traced them to somewhere in France in the end. But I laugh, but I used to call him my pen pal, because I just actually thought how sad if you feel you have to write these letters, then actually you've got a very sad life, And by then I was processing things a little bit more clearly, and I was thinking of a future. I was thinking, God, I've got a future, but somebody who's in such a state, they need to do that to make themselves feel better, hasn't really got a future.
Interesting. Interesting. So how are your boys now? How have they processed all of this? Are they okay now?
I don't think they've read the book yet. I don't think they're ready to read the book. I think their wives have read the book. They've got a copy each, but it's something I've just given them. It's gone on the shelf, and that's up to them. One day, they might read it. They went through as much pain, if not more pain, than I did. You can't replace a parent, and that's the long and the short of it is they've got married without their dad being there. They've had children without their father being there. All those, graduations from university, the Christmas before Paula had been killed, they'd gone to their first concert together up in London. They'd been to see Iron Maiden. They'd had their first beer with their dad, and then he was taken away. So all those things they've had to miss out on. However, their strength and tenacity, the support of their wives and their wives' families,
and maybe their mum
and their friends and their mum, I think they've done an incredibly good job. They've turned out both extremely well balanced, fantastic partners, fantastic parents. I was so fortunate not to lose them to all of the things they could have fallen into: alcohol, drugs, anything. And a friend of mine who'd lost her husband, who's mentioned in the book, when her two were she was in fact pregnant with her second child, and her first child was only 18 months. And she was one of the first I needed to get there. She lost her husband in Northern Ireland in 1991. And she was one of the first I said, I need to have her here with me. I knew she was going to understand the pain. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table and saying to her, I just want my normal life back. And she said, you're not going to get your normal life back. You've got to create a new normal life. And then she held my hand and she said, but they're up. The boys are up. And they've had all that input from Paul. He's moulded them, and he's been there as a fantastic representative of what they should be looking at becoming in their own way. He's the best example a boy could have, and she was right, and I think that set them up for life.
Take a moment, Paula. Take a moment.
Sorry.
There's absolutely no need to apologise. I appreciate this is difficult to talk about.
Yeah, I don't often talk about it. Okay.
I really I've enjoyed listening to this story, because I think the amount of what you've shown in terms of pride in Paul and your family and the dignity you've shown here, I think has been a lesson to all of us in incredibly difficult circumstances. And I really would like to thank you for taking the time to tell parts of this story, because it's obviously clearly not all of it, because we only have an hour or so. But the book has been written. It is available on Amazon, I assume. So if people want to read that story, I think I haven't read it yet. I can't recommend it enough, because I think there's a lot to be learnt here. Is there anything else you would like to add before we end the recording?
Gosh, I think I would probably just reiterate for people to remember freedom comes at a cost, and not to forget the people who have to carry on with their lives every day, who carry the mortgage of everyone's freedom.
Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, before Steve and Tip chat about what we've just heard, you may be interested to know that here at Company of Makers, we've got loads of online activities for veterans to get involved in. As well as this podcast, we've got online talks with inspiring guests. And we've got workshops where you can have a go at things like drawing, writing and photography. To register your interest, just head over to companyofmakers.com/workshops. Now, back to Steve and Tip.
So that is quite a hard story to listen to, if I'm absolutely honest. And like I said, the dignity with which she told that story is quite remarkable, considering how difficult that story is. Her book has now been published as well. Remarkable Tip.
I think words fall down in how much I appreciate, her strength, resilience, her bravery, and love she has for her husband and family. That's the reason for telling my story in a previous episode, because it's about our people. It's about our people. It's about their professionalism, but also their willingness to make that ultimate sacrifice for everything we love. And I think, that the epitaph, the old, freedom isn't free. Freedom doesn't come free. It's so apt.
Yeah, it has a price.
Indeed. It's inherited, that inheritance comes with a bill as well, doesn't it?
Why is it important then to share these stories, do you think? Because it's not easy for people to talk about these things, is it?
No, it's not. I think where we are today and technology and moving forward and that, but fundamentally we are all human beings. We're human beings. And no matter what side you take in a war or anything else, you lose people. And the sadness, the loss, it's heart-wrenching. It really is heart-wrenching. And I think unless we make sure that humans realize that, that hardship you go through when you lose somebody that is so close to you, you rely upon because of the bond you have with that person. It's really important that people understand that it's not like on the TV. It's not like in the movies. The reality of that loss is, complete. It even makes me emotional thinking about it and talking about it now.
Well, you did say that after you'd listened to what Paula had to say, how it, we didn't record it, but obviously you said it made you feel really emotional. And I think the other thing is that the amount of time since it happened that has elapsed for her to be able to tell that story as well. I mean, she says she couldn't have done that, any more recently. She couldn't have done it any sooner.
I can understand that. And I think even for many people in the veteran community that are, they've still got open wounds, they're still feeling very vulnerable. I think I can say, and, we can say that statistically, but even just as a human being, time heals wounds. And time makes, we'll move on and you can be able to think more clear about what's happened in that. You think about it, what Paula went through and her family went through, but also the intrusive nature of, from the press, from other elements and, from other people that, even like hate crimes, and things like that. It's completely sad And she's so strong and resilient. She's still able to document it and talk about it. And she can do that, after that time gap, because, she's able to now.
And the service as well, which was completely, unexpected, the number of people turning up to celebrate his life.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I've been to quite a few ceremonies, burying people that have died on operations. And I have to admit that is, it's very much, it's like that. It's that there's a massive support in our community. And even though, we maybe beat ourselves to say, that we don't reflect on, sacrifice or, that unselfishness of some of our veterans and like I say, our blue light services and, the NHS staff and everything. These people are incredibly compassionate and professional about what they do. But it's, that ability to sacrifice that, I think, as a society, we still, hold that close to our heart and respect it and respect those people that have, made those sacrifices. So it's, to me, it's, although it's been more, should we say, common than it should be, that we've had to do it so many more times, sadly, I'd say it's, I'm happy that our society still holds the people are, with the respect they deserve.
But there is also that challenge, isn't there, particularly with the Iraq War? It's kind of mired in political controversy. Not that we're going to get into that, but I think it makes it, there won't be any sort of national commemoration like there was, say, for the Falklands, the 40th last year. So it's difficult, isn't it, when that's not commemorated with quite the same level of vigor, shall we say?
No, I mean, not at all. I mean, when it isn't, I mean, because, there's a large part of society that still look upon it as an illegal war as such, as they say. But when you're a service person and you're serving, a nation or a culture that is democratically elected, which has freedoms of freedom of speech, freedom of humanity, which again, no matter, I'm not a politician, but we have that in the UK, and that's what we fight for to protect. And when the operations I've been on, which, it's not a few, but when we landed on the L4 at the start of the campaign in Iraq, we were liberators. We became from war fighting, killing the enemy, capturing the enemy, to within minutes becoming, the saviors. We were liberators. The people there that were, they seen us on. We've saved them from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein. So the initial thing after the war fighting stopped, within minutes, we're talking we're feeding, we're giving water, we're giving medical support, we're giving guidance, we're trying to help people. And my lasting image of that initial phase of the Iraq operation is just, we were liberators. We were heroes, which I think is quite hard considering how the operation, carried on. And, but I'm not a politician. And I have to say, with, the armed forces, or the Allied armed forces generally, were just impeccable and professional. And we weren't there to sort of take over a country. We were there to help a country, be self-determined in some way. But for those of us that served there and were on the ground, I think all of us will know that we done as we were ordered to do, but we done it with a very, very, shall we say, resolute, compassionate sort of feeling towards those people.
Yeah, you did your job to the best of your ability.
Yeah,
and I think it's fair to say that Paula's done a great job telling this story and writing this book as well.
But that's I mean, that, like, listening to Paula was that summed everything up to me, and that's it. And that compassion, that resilience, and her strength has helped me massively. Just listening to her story just brings all the issues, but all the things that were reservations I had in my head about why we were there was because for people like Paula and her family. And, I mean, it's she has helped me massively just by listening to her story.
There are consequences. And as she said, there's a price.
No, an incredible price. And like I say, our feelings and thoughts, and all the words that Paula said, they resonate massively, more so nowadays because of for the people of Ukraine and what they're having to deal with. They never asked for this. And we all know that war is the last option possible. So with that, they have no choice. They're fighting for all those freedoms.
How many Paulas are there in the Ukraine?
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, sadly. And in the future.
Yeah. So we will put a link to Paula's book in the description if you'd like to order a copy, recommended reading. And I'd just like to say thanks again, Tip.
No, thank you very much. And thank you, Paula, so much.
Before you go, if you're a member of the Armed Forces community and need support with your mental health, Op Courage can help. Use the link in this podcast description for details. Or you can phone the Combat Stress Helpline on 0800 138 1619. If you'd like to contact us, email studio@companyofmakers.com.
Finally, we're giving a really big shout out to our funders, the Royal Navy and Royal Marines Charity, and the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Thank you.
This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Tip Cullen and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers. Podcast Talks Workshops.